Right there. Cool. Alrighty. Welcome to class. As far as announcements, this is where we are this month. Kind of bums me out, but with COVID numbers being ridiculous, what it is. We are doing Saber this month. I assume that's why everybody's here. Or you're here because it's Saturday and it's 12:30, and where else are you supposed to be? Because that, that happens too. Let's start with, so I sent out an email earlier that had just some kind of basic information about the stuff we were going over this month. The primary source that we're going to be using is, I'm leaning towards Roworth more than I am Hutton. Hutton is a good source. It's a later source. He's trying to pull from as many things as he can. But he is also, I feel like Hutton in some ways is really recreating things versus being a little more in place with it. So most of the stuff that we're working with is going to be from Roworth. However, there's a few things that Hutton is super helpful with. So if we start with, let me share the screen. Let's see, we need that one. Okay, I don't know if everybody can see that. So Hutton first tells us to hold the saber. One thing that I've said for everybody doing class is that if you want to use a stick, you can use a stick. So this is Hutton's picture holding the saber. His explanation, and I don't know if you can see here, we've kind of got the thumb on the back. He also says in the text that you can do it by putting a thumb to the side. What I suggest is if you are using a stick, you may not be able to put your thumb on the back. You may need to put it side so that it's kind of in line with the fingers like that. Totally fine. It totally works. There are things that Hutton does not, he is not super helpful with. So if you look at the wrist in this picture, it's pretty well in line. It's pretty good. He doesn't ever tell you not to break the wrist, right? So what we know from doing cutting drills, what we know from our cutting practice is that if you're trying to cut with a wrist that's really bent, it's kind of at a funny angle, like you're trying to really make this work, it's gonna be really rough on the wrist, and it's actually gonna be really rough on your cut. So we're gonna start with that. So if you have a stick, let me grab a stick real quick. I just think you put your hand in that handshake grip, that normal grip that we have, and rather than putting it on the back so it's straight in line, you're just putting it next to it so that it's in line with your fingers. It's wrapping around. In fact, let me see if he says it right. I think he says it right here. Parts of the saber. So a lot of this stuff we talked about when we did single stick, was that 2 weeks ago? But here we go. The fingers. Must be lightly but firmly closed around the grip with the thumb extended along the back of it, the center knuckles being the same line as the edge. The thumb may, however, be sometimes shifted in order to relieve the hand and place round the grip similarly to the fingers. Some of that depends on what you're using and how you're using it. So 2 weeks ago when we did single stick, Mark took the single stick that we had that had the ball on it and basically like pinched it so that he could get his hand on there. I have used broadswords, Scottish basket hilts that I couldn't get my thumb on that line. I had to move it around. So if that's what you do, then that's totally fine. So what we're going to start with is we're going to start with some warm-ups. We're actually going to start with guards. Well, we're going to start with our footwork. So, and if at any point in time I need to slow down, if you can't hear me, I'm trying to figure this out as much as I can, but the audio, I'm not sure how it's going to work. Okay. So for our footwork, back up enough that you can actually see it. He says you put your right foot forward. Now this is specifically from Roworth, but Roworth says you keep your feet 14 to 18 inches apart. So you're really not talking, with your footwork, you're really not talking about doing a really wide step. You're really keeping it relatively close.
Hey, Jordan.
Yeah.
Can you unshare the document so your video gets big again?
I absolutely can. There we go. So with feet, you're just going to keep it 12 to 14 inches. He does say when you retreat that front foot, that you're going to bring it back to where your back foot is. So because of that, you don't want to keep them so in line, because if you bring them too far in line, then you're just hitting your own foot, right? That doesn't give you any way to pass backwards. So we start with that kind of shortened up position. He tells us turn the body to the side. So you're kind of blading yourself. Way good reason for this is if I'm here, if I'm facing my opponent, I have this much room to clear. If I turn, I have this much room to clear. And that should be pretty easy to see on video, like, okay, this is really narrow. I turn my hips and then all of a sudden I'm bringing it really wide. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with that. Now this part comes from Hutton, but he says put all of your weight on your back foot. He says you don't want to keep much weight on your front foot because of the ability to be able to move your feet. So if I go back to my feet, from here, I need to have as much weight loaded on that back foot so that if I need to step this way, I can step this way. If I need to step this way, I can step this way. If I want to go straight forward, I can go straight forward. So what I want to do,
I was gonna say, does he say anything about the angle, like as far as like being having your feet at a 90, at a 130, 45, 60, like, or it's like
he said
what angle this should be at between your feet?
He says that your right foot is kind of perpendicular to your back foot.
Roughly a 90.
Yeah, roughly 90. The thing to keep in mind here is that a lot of saber work, you're working straight on a line. Mm-hmm. You might be doing a disengage. You might be doing something where you're moving the blade around and then going to the other side. But what you're not doing is you're not necessarily stepping super wide. It's not like longsword where suddenly I'm here and I'm stepping to the outside. you're doing a lot of your blade work here. You may be moving to the outside as you lunge this way. That's fine. You might be doing the same thing as you lunge this way. That's fine. But you're really going to keep your feet pretty much in line. So what I'm going to have us do for a warm-up is we're going to start in that on guard position. We're just going to do some. Now what I'm going to tell you right now is that the more you sit in this position, the more your thighs are going to like hate you. That's okay. That's what it is. But you're going to kind of sit into that, and then we're just going to go from here and step. Go back, step. You don't have to do it with a stick in your hand. You're just stepping. You're just working on that. I was looking at Roworth this morning. He says when you step, you're extending to the point that your back leg is straight. So that lunge is really here where you're getting that line. If I go sideways, I'm getting to that line where my leg and my hip are in line with my shoulders as I step. So we're really just going from that back foot, really launching off of it. Do about 20 of those. If you want to, we can do 20 of them on the other side, just so that we're not exercising just one side. This doesn't have anything to do with the fencing we're doing. So I'm going to give you that precursor right now. But we'll just start on the, put your weight on your right leg and step. If you want to practice that as a drill too, you can do those, and then you can switch it instead of stepping to just stepping straight in line, just work on stepping off. So it's going to do some things as you do that. By stepping off the line, that's going to change your mechanics a little bit. It's also going to change some of your parrying mechanisms. So I'm here, and as I step, I'm going to have to parry, but I'm going to have to parry to this side instead of keeping it. I don't want to step out here and parry this way. I don't want to thrust this way because we're assuming my opponent's right here on that center line, right? So the next thing is he says the left hand may be raised to the height of the left ear or maybe fixed to the left hip. And then he says, when you lunge, throw your hand backwards or to your thigh. The key, so This, as we were playing with it last time when we were doing the single stick stuff, I'm convinced that if I put my hand on my hip or I put my hand up, because of my hand position, it's actually bringing my torso further upright, right? So you can do it without putting your hand up. Like you can keep that core stability. It's just a aid. It's just super helpful that you can have your hand up. And so that's pulling some of your weight backwards. So when you step, and then by throwing it out, essentially you're countering that weight balance. I have heard people say, "Oh yeah, well it's so that you can keep balance. Like that's why you put your hand up here." I disagree with it, but it does change your core, right? So we can practice some of those. In fact, you can practice some of it with. Hutton, move. You can practice some of it. I didn't have a giant dog in my way. Okay. We can practice stepping to the inside and stepping to the outside and just throwing that hand back as you step forward. Here, here, just throwing that hand back, putting it on your, I feel like you throw it back if your hand's up by your ear. So if I keep my hand back here, I'm going to throw that backwards. If I have it on my hip, I don't know that I'm really going to kick it out backwards. That seems kind of awkward and weird.
Something I'm noticing is I tend to maybe, and to keep my hand, like if I'm stepping offline, I'm moving, keep my hand on that line, or if I'm moving out, like I'm still keeping my hand on the same line as the weapon hand. As if throw your body out to one side or the other.
And sometimes we have some really weird, like we have weird stuff that's in rapier, where you get this like, I'm going to lunge, but I'm going to throw everything backwards behind me in this weird opposite direction. So I'm thrusting as I go this way.
Yeah, like a piranha.
Yeah, like it's crazy stuff. It's nuts, but it's really about, okay, wait, this way, void this space. So another advantage that this footwork has is if all my weight is on my back leg, it's a lot easier to slip that front foot, right? So I can be here and then pull it back. Somebody cuts against my leg, I pull it back. The deeper the stance, the further we have to go. So if we're really into a deep stance, it's harder to bring it all the way back. When we're kind of in that shallow, upright stance that we're going to be with Saber, it's less hard, right? So we're here, and we're just slipping that leg. I'd have to find the picture. Let's see if I can find it real quick. There are see if I can see it. So this is from Hutton. I'm going to show you this, but it's ridiculous. This is kind of the extent of the step that you're going to get into. Like this under stop thrust is ridiculous. Moving from that position and just stepping so low that that's where you are is nuts. But this picture is literally from Hutton. So, I mean, you can take that front step as far as you want, but he does mention that you want to keep, you really want to keep from stepping too deep into it, because there's a gamble that you make when you do this.
I will say that one would make a very good warm-up because you are taking it to the extreme.
Right, right. So, I mean, if you look at this, and if we really wanted to look at it, that's ridiculous, right? Like, okay, we are lunging so deep that our hand can go on the ground. Like, this is a long lunge. Well, at least I guess he's lunging, right?
That's exhausting.
No, it is exhausting. It may not be a bad warm-up, though. It may not be a bad, like, okay, I'm going to work on just lunging. And I think this one probably works better if your hand is on your hip. Because as you drop into that lunge, your hand can go down that way. But like, you want some killer thighs. That's going to give you some killer thighs. Because, man, I did it a couple of times, and I'm starting to hate it. Questions on that footwork stuff?
Nothing.
Yeah, it's different. I think you probably could do that kind of lunge with like longsword, but I think there's a problem with it. And I think the major problem is that you lunge in that far and you're taking a gamble that thrust that you're going to make is going to land.
That it's going to land, and that it's also going to be able to protect you.
Right. Like,
because that it leaves you very, very exposed.
Right.
And does not give you the opportunity for the abzuger to retreat.
Now, that being the case, if we go back to that picture, if we go back to this, what we can tell from this picture is that all of his weight is forward. Like, there's no way for your weight to be 70-30. Like, most of your weight is on that front leg.
Something that I think is a good note there is he is launching, like, because you mentioned, like, you're straightening that trail leg, right, with that lunge.
Oh, yeah.
And very much straightening that and then dropping straight forward. Ow. But he's also keeping that perfectly in line with his body.
Right.
So make sure if you are doing it, you're not like leaving your hips raised and dropping, hinging at the hips, or letting your leg go forward and then throwing your body back. You really have to dive fully into that and try to keep your torso and your leg in alignment.
What I can tell you from this is if you dedicate it, if you're sure that this is going to land, you are 100% sure it's going to land, which it's a gamble, but all right. You're sure that's going to land, you are 100% going to recover forward. There is no recovering backward in this situation. If you look at the toe, there's space between the heel and like half of the side of the foot. He's totally going to recover forward. Yeah. So, okay, questions on that stuff? Yeah. No.
Anybody else's thighs exhausted from just trying that a couple times?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like it's killing my thighs. It's not necessarily killing my my calves, but man, my thighs are.
Yep.
I don't know that I need to do that. Well,
that's exactly why you need to do that.
That's exactly what I need to do. I need to do that more, right? Like, we joke about Hema booty, and we joke about the one in Vadi where like, oh no, that's super Hema booty. But like, I think you do this consistently, like it's going to be really hard not to have thighs that are, you know, monstrous. Okay. All right, we'll start talking about the sword then. So what I'm going to try to do with most of this stuff is give you a little bit of an intro. We'll do some of the drills that he talks about. There are some things where he says this is the attack that you make, and then you cover it this way. And we may get into some of that potentially next week. We'll see how far we get with things today. But yeah. So we've got our sword or our stick or whatever. Doesn't even have to be. What's that?
Other weapon facsimile.
Other weapon facsimile. Doesn't really matter what it is, because I suggest a 36-inch stick, but that's just because that's kind of your overall length here, so that makes your thrust. It makes your thrust right, because you don't want to grab, like, I think I have an 18-inch stick in my little basket here, but I hate to take like a little tiny stick and then I thrust, and I feel like, oh yeah, I can hit them from here, and then I pick up a sword and it's wrong because I've been working with a stick that's the wrong length, but whatever. Okay. Inside and outside guards. Oh, it was always weird. Okay. So we have two guards that we're going, or we have three guards that we're going to play with right here. The first one is, yeah, like Jack, just standing here, I'm like, man, I don't do this enough. Because I'm just feeling it, just standing here, and I'm like, yeah, this is a bad day. Okay, so we have our medium guard, which is right here in the middle. What he tells us is that it affords no cover. And that's because it's right here in the middle. It's not super helpful. So that's your medium guard. Your outside, we're going to roll the wrist out this way. You want to make sure that you're not overextending. So I don't want to turn my wrist too far this way. I want to kind of turn it a little bit. My thumb is still in line with my forearm versus here where it's way out of line. The point here is that as I parry that way, I'm still keeping this structure. What we really want to avoid with all of these is this idea of, oh, I'm just going to turn my wrist super wide because suddenly your structure's broken, and it may work with a stick in your hand. It might work for me to totally turn my wrist much further than I need to, but here's the problem. If somebody cuts at me and I bring my wrist super weird, I don't have any structure supporting that, which means suddenly they're just going to blow right through it. Or I'm going to end up hurting my wrist. And we can avoid hurting ourselves. Like,
I just wanted to comment on, think of it less as turning your wrist out, and like your forearm, like everyone knows you have like ulna and radius that are right next to each other. Think of like not necessarily turning your wrist out, but rotating your forearm out, because that will keep your thumb still in line with your ulna here, and you still have structural stability as you rotate that from one side to the other. But if you rotate the wrist out, then obviously you're breaking that wrist right here. So that impact comes in. You can see that that line is out here. It's into the wrist. Whereas if I rotate my forearm for that same thing, that line is still in line with the forearm. So if it helps you, think of rotating your forearm as that wrist movement rather than throwing your hand out to one side or the other.
The thing to remember here is the same thing with any of this single-handed stuff. You're going to do it in such a way that you're still keeping that point on line. Now, there are some parries and there's some guards that we can go over where your point is up. I don't like them. I don't like them as much. And the reason I don't like them as much is it doesn't give you a immediate second response from this parry. So I can parry here, but it's better to be able to lunge from here than to bring it upright. I've blocked it, and now I have to do something crazy to cut around. Some of our upper stuff is a little bit different, and we'll definitely be there in a second. Okay? So I want everybody to just go from that middle guard and then just parry to the outside. Outside. Note on outside and inside. When we are using these one-handed weapons, your outside is your backside. Your inside is where your torso is. What that means is if you're left-handed, if I'm doing all of this left-handed, it means that my outside is actually to my left, my inside's to my right. If I'm right-handed, my outside's to my right, my inside's to my left. None of these texts talk about, well, what if you're left-handed? That's not unusual. That's something that we run into with longsword anyway, right?
Most sources.
Texts say, this is how you fight as somebody who's left-handed. Like, never comes up because, I don't know, they're sinister or something, right? So we're just going to do that. Sit in our stance. Parry to the outside. If you want to, you can parry to the outside, thrust. To the outside, thrust. We can do the same thing on the inside. Now, with the inside, he says you're going to turn your wrist so that your fingernails are upward. So it's that same thing that we've been doing with short guard, where you're bringing your true edge up. The same thing on this side. Maybe not necessarily to that full extension, but you're still bringing it over here. So we're going to go to the left, middle, right, middle, left, middle, right. In fact, if you have a spot on your wall, on wherever it is you're practicing, sometimes it's helpful to take a piece of tape, just throw it on the wall and just go, okay, this is where my point is. And without moving my point off the line to come over here, I'm going to keep it on that same point, and I'm going to move here. I'm going to move here. You can do it with your camera if you're adventurous.
I think that's actually a really good one, because then you have like if you're using a webcam and you are able to look at your own form and just keep a little bit of distance, but you think of like keeping the point right at the camera, and you can see on screen when your point is drifting.
It'll also give you, it can help with point deviation. So I'm obviously deviating a little bit here to here to here. But is that within 2 inches? Is that within 3 inches? Well, yeah, sure. Like that's still, I'm still going to hit kind of the same spot. And again, the more that you just sit here in your stance, I don't know. I'm kind of hating life right now, and that's probably okay. Okay.
Arm starts to get a little bit tired as well.
What's that?
The arm starts to get a little bit tired as well.
Yeah, yeah, and that, well,
Maybe that's because I'm using something a little heavier than a stick, but
yeah, and that's actually one of the downsides to like single-handed weapons. I'm sure that Adam runs into it with sword and buckler, where like that sword hand better be good because that's where all your weight is, like most of the time, and it gets to be rough. Okay. So that tip control drill, that's something that we can do as solo practice, like a bunch, right? It's easy enough to find a place on. We've done it at the gym sometimes. We've done this exact same drill with a longsword. So if you're looking at what things work with both, if I grab my longsword, if I have my longsword and I have it lined up in that same spot, I can work on that short guard here and here, and I can just work on keeping that on that same point. So that's a drill that's something that you can do no matter what you're doing. Because you can use that for both. Jack, I would suggest the rapier may not be a bad idea.
that's what I realized that I went to grab.
One of my reasonings for doing this class for this month, I had a lot of fun when we were doing single stick the other day because I don't feel like we do it enough. It's kind of easy to fall into this habit of like, oh, we're just doing long swords, so we're just going through whatever. But the cool part is about like single stick and rapier and whatever. I'm not making wide actions because I can do a lot of things with just fine manipulation with the hands. We did not talk about the hanging guard. So I'm going to email this out, but there is a picture that I posted to the, there's a picture that I posted to the Facebook group or the Facebook page. Pull this over here. Having issues sometimes sharing the screen, so.
Went and found that same rapier.
I don't know if that is sharing or not.
Yeah, no, and yeah, when you guys talk about a rapier, it's like, wait, I have that exact same rapier as Jack. Yeah, fine.
Should have thought of it earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's super helpful. So I'm gonna send this out as an email. I don't know who did this picture. I wish that I did, because I'd love to give credit where credit was due. This actually is Hutton's guards. So the ones that we were just going over are kind of here by this C5, the C6, where you're pairing either way. This one that's in the middle, we can talk about that a little bit. That's kind of a ready position that he shows. I've seen people use this one a lot of times. If you're about to salute, you're waiting for your opponent or whatever, you just go from that low, you salute, you bring it right back down. But I will send this out because it's helpful. He gives us some guards that are on the inside and the outside that are kind of these low hangings. So that's what we have here and here, where you're just hanging it low. Again, he talks about parrying those, and he talks about putting your sword there, but he also talks about slipping the leg. And my 2 cents is, it makes a lot more sense if somebody is cutting to your lower leg. Same thing that Fiore tells us. If they're cutting to your lower leg, rather than putting your sword there to block it, you just slip the leg. You bring that leg back, especially since there's no weight on it. So let me see if I can zoom in on this. And so if we look at his hangings, this one that's up by C1, kind of up here in this upper quadrant, he's hanging the tip, but he's not hanging the tip. He's not hanging it super hard and super far. He's hanging it kind of a little bit out here in front of him. He's still looking underneath the guard, but he's just hanging that tip in. So the other side, he does some different things. And this is that C1 is kind of on the inside. On the outside, he's flipping the wrist or he's leaving it up. So that's what C1 is and C2 is. Those are on the outside. So rather than parrying and hanging it this way, he's turning the wrist to catch it this way. It's kind of similar to that one finestra that we have, or not finestra, posta de donna, where you're hanging it this way so that you can block a strike with a longsword. In this case, he's just bringing the tip this way.
Are you talking about the one on the right in C2?
Yeah, the one on C2. So yeah, he's parrying it, but he's parrying it just like he's turning the wrist.
So point to the outside there.
To the outside, yeah. Yeah, he's just bringing it to the outside. So they cut at you, and you kind of step in and catch it, and then you're going to cut around. The thing to notice about is he says things about keeping your thumb and your index finger, or your thumb and your middle finger and your index finger tight. What he doesn't tell you to do is keep all of your fingers tight. And I think a interesting interpretation that we haven't played with historically has been this kind of idea that, so if we go back to our wrist position, and we're keeping this in line, putting that thumb on the back keeps that blade position. It lets you index it. You know exactly where your blade is, right? If you put your thumb next to it, it's less so, but it works. What we don't want to do is we don't want to come into a hammer grip for the exact same reasons that we don't want to do a hammer grip with longsword. We go into a hammer grip, suddenly our tip trails, and rather than letting that tip be forward. It's good to know that Hutton specifically calls out, Hutton specifically calls out keeping that line, making sure that that point comes out, but he says all of your attacks happen from the middle of your sword up. So you're using your foible for all of your attacks. You're using your fortes for all your parries. Which is good to keep in mind, because you want to think about, okay, I'm making my cut and I'm going to make it out here with the forte or with the foible, not with forte. I'm doing all those parries. When I'm doing my parry here, it kind of goes back to some of the things we've been talking about in longsword, right? If I parry with a longsword, and I'm thinking about parrying way out here versus keeping it nice and close, this is a lot better and it's a lot less motion. But it's the exact same thing with Saber, because I'm keeping my hands really close. I'm keeping my arms really close. I'm using that forte. They're cutting at me with the foible. I'm using my forearm. I'm using my guard to catch it. Whether you're using a saber, whether you're using a longsword, whether you're using a rapier.
Can I throw just a quick note in there, just as a point of clarification? So keep in mind that there is a difference between blocking out straight and keeping your arms close, but still straight and structured. One of the things that I see a lot is people think, oh, if I'm close, I'm pulling my hands in. So like I'm bending my arms. So this, you see how there's this 90 in my elbow? Like that's where I have lost structure. But I can still keep my arms straight. Granted, this would be more applicable.
So here,
but like my arms are straight here. My arms are still straight here, and I've only moved, you know, maybe 6 to 8 inches over.
versus
I can have, this is structured. Yes, this is also structured. I've got a slight bend in my elbow, but my elbow is still more closer to straight than not. This is not structured because you're putting this extreme bend in your elbow, so that force goes straight out rather than right here where it's able to travel up your arm and into your torso.
Yeah.
So there is a slight caveat there. It's like parrying close is generally safer, but still try to make sure you do keep that structure. Make sure you don't have any points in your body where you have these hard angles where like a force is going straight out of your arm, which means that joint is where you are receiving all of that force.
Right. Right. And that real advantage is that you're going to block it and you're absorbing that force with your body. If you're absorbing it with your wrists, that means if somebody's swinging with a particular amount of force, you're taking all of that force to those joints, and
you're going to have a bad day.
You might be okay. It may also screw you over. So, okay. So I will send out this. I'll send out an email this picture. I feel like it's super helpful, and I feel like it goes over all of these guards pretty well. There's actually a couple of things that I'll send out in this week's email. I've actually printed it out because if we look at the printout, it gives us his cut diagram. So that C1, that C2, that is all the way that, if I can share it again. Let's see. Screen share. Oh, not that one. Fine. I'll bring this one over. I'll just zoom it out a little bit. So I actually blew this up in such a way on, I blew it up in such a way that when you put it on, and I hope that nobody's looking at this on their phone because it's really tough when you're looking at it this size. What it ends up doing is I printed this one out and it just fits on an 8.5 by 11. So if you then want to like print it out and go through, those are his cuts. That stuff's all there. Those are all of his guards. What he tells us about these ones that are in the middle is he says that that middle guard isn't actually covering anything. It's not really good for anything.
Jordan,
You sharing?
Yeah.
we just see your mountain background. So
Son of-
that's all I'm seeing. I'm just seeing your mountain background.
Okay. Then, okay.
Now I can see it.
There we go.
Is this basically like the Hutton Square instead of the Meyer Square? It's the Hutton
Yeah,
Square.
kind of. So the reason that the reason I moved it, I've got both my monitors going, and so I told it to read from monitor 2, and so it was giving what was on monitor 2. So if we get it as big as I can get it without, that's fine. Okay. So if we're looking at this, that's giving us all of the guards that he has. It also gives us all of his cuts. I will also make a note here that Hutton gives us a couple of guards and a couple of cuts in this diagram that he doesn't with his cutting that we're going to do. So the guards that he doesn't go over, I'm gonna go over this guard, but the guard that he doesn't go over is, where is it?
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like each of these guards is defending against that cutting line,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So, like C7 is against somebody cutting a descending cut. C8 is defending against somebody
Right.
defending against a rising cut from below.
Right. So the one that's at the top right there by C7 is called St. George's Guard. Kim, you were asking about broadsword stuff. That is 100% shown in most of the broadsword texts, is a St. George's Guard, where you're bringing it up here. You're essentially catching it at the top. What I will say with all of these is that they're protecting you, but if that point isn't online, what you're going to do, if I catch something with that St. George's Guard over the top, I'm going to catch it, and then I'm essentially going to hang it out here to the side and then cut the outside. If we think about the peasant strike, where we're catching it and then we're letting it roll and then we're coming to the other side, this is very similar, where we're catching it here. We're just going to let that slide off. We're going to let it parry off this way, and then we're going to cut. Or cut, I guess. That makes sense. That C8. So Hutton shows us all of these. Hutton shows us these 8 cuts. That's not part of his cutting diagram. It's not part of, this is how he says that we need to cut all of these cuts. But those are Hutton's 8 cuts. When we look at Roworth, he actually doesn't say cut that cut from above. For kind of the same reason that Fiore says you don't cut from straight above. Right? It's way too easy if somebody is cutting straight from above to just parry it this way. And sometimes we see it with longsword sources where we're parrying it this way and we're catching it and then we're doing this and then hitting them with the pommel or whatever. But in this case, like, okay, I'm just going to catch it, or I'm going to catch it this way. I'm going to let it roll off, and then I'm going to cut to the other side. Oh. It is such a joy to be going over this stuff in the house and realizing that I am not knocking holes in my ceiling. And I only have 8-foot ceilings. So I'll send out an email that has this picture. The other thing that Hutton tells us to do is, he says, really anybody practicing this art should know how to use a foil. And so he talks about essentially what's modern Olympic fencing of the time. So I'll send this picture out too. This is just Olympic guards, like some of the parries. It's helpful to understand them. It's helpful sometimes when you're going through these texts, it's helpful to understand the term, because they use the same verbiage. In the case of Hutton, he uses the same verbiage as modern fencing does. So your inside guard, a lot of times he's talking about blocking to a quart. Or your outside guard, he's talking about blocking to a terce. I don't expect everybody to know all these, but I will make sure that all gets sent out in email. Questions on that stuff so far? Okay. Everybody grab a drink.
That people want to like actually touch on beyond just the form.
Right. So we'll do the form, and then we can play with some of these other guards too. At this point in time, what I have is making the cuts that he tells us to cut, and then some form through that. So we have an advantage when we go to, say, Hutton, where basically what he starts out with is, here is how you practice by yourself. He says, here's how you do the guards. Here's how you make the cuts. Here is how you practice doing cuts and doing guards. Here are some practice techniques that you can do. Then he has some partner drills. Unfortunately, we're not going to get into partner drills unless we want to imagine a partner, which is totally fine. We can absolutely do that. But it's really hard to be like, oh, well, yeah, and then your partner's going to parry this way, and then you have to counter it. Okay, so if we go back to, let me see if I can find his linear. There's the Saber. So that one in the middle of that where the sword point was down, he calls that his first position. High second. There's our middle guard. Guard, St. George's Guard. Here we go. Share it. Sharing it right there. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. Okay. So he talks about the Moulinier, and this is just your cuts. We talked about this being the Meyer square, or this one being the Hutton square. Kind of is. So it's a 6 cuts, a diagonal cut from the right to the left. From the left to the right, the third is diagonal upward from the right to the left. The fourth is diagonal up from left to the right. The fifth is horizontal. Let me see if I can make this bigger. So here is where he gives us that picture, that this is cutting diagram. Honestly, I feel like that other guard picture that I have is better, but that's okay. So we're going to start with our cuts from above. We're going to cut above right to the left. Now, the thing that I want everybody to keep in mind with this is you're going to cut through and then you're going to go to the other side. Don't break that wrist until you are through the cut. So you're going to start out here. You're going to cut down. Once you're here, Roworth explains it better, but I don't have a digital copy of Roworth that I could put. So he says you cut it here, and then at this point in time, you can break your wrist to make the cut back up here. In fact, Roworth explains you can make your cut. Once you're down here, you essentially can bring it up. And then you can make your cut this way. But if you're going to bring it around, we're going to cut here. We're going to cut down. We're going to parry it here. We're going to have that low hanging. We're going to bring it up. We're going to cut from here down. Now we're going to break the wrist. That cut from underneath is kind of awkward. Super awkward because you're putting your wrist in a funny position. But your first 2 cuts are above. And then we're going to parry here, up, cut down. You could, if you just want to do those first 2, cut, parry, cut, parry, bring that up, cut, parry. That makes sense? So we're just rolling it through those cuts. So cut, parry out here, bring it up. And all you're doing is rolling it on that same line. But I don't want you to break your wrist. I don't want you to flip that wrist too much too early. So you don't want to start making that cut and then realize that you're going to make the cut from above over here. So then like you just kind of break it at the end. Too much experience cutting with single-handed weapons on a target. You don't want to get to a position where you get here and you go, okay, I'm setting up, I'm thinking too far ahead, and now I'm going to break my wrist, because this is where your cut's going to fail. You're not through your target, so you want to make sure you get through your target, and then you break it. Get through your target, break it. Break it. That makes sense? 3s and 4s are opposites. So this is kind of Meyer square, but it is absolutely not in a very essential way. Your cuts are going to come, you're going to come down. You're going to come down. Now you're going to come up. You're going to come up. 5s and 6s are lateral cuts that go along the middle. So your 4 comes up, your 5 cuts across, you turn your wrist, your 6 comes across. And again, I will send that other, I feel like that other picture shows it better. And we can actually start playing with some of the guards. I mentioned when we did single stick that they say you put the target up on the wall. I went back and found it this week. Roworth says you hang it a far enough distance from you that you're not actually going to hit it. You draw a line. That line is kind of the middle here. You're going to stay on that line. When we talk about our center lines in longsword, that's really your center line, right? You're just keeping that center line, and then you're lunging or you're making that cut on that center line. Hutton actually tells us, and so does Roworth, that when you hang it up is you're going to put it on your wall just below the line of like your shoulder. So when you put it up on the wall, it should be just below your shoulder height. And that's where you're going to make your cuts. Yeah. So again, that combination is we're going to cut down. We're going to break it down here. We're going to cut down. We're going to cut up. We're going to cut up. We're going to cut across. We're going to cut across. Now you can cut down, down, up, up, crossed. I think the hardest part is getting this to work in a way that is not breaking my head because I'm thinking Meyer squares, but it's way too easy to go, okay, cut down, cut up, cut down, cut up, cut down, cut up. Like, yes, you could do Meyer square with a saber. Except then you're only getting 4 of the 6 cuts that he gives us. He doesn't give you a cut from above. He doesn't give you a cut from below. In this diagram, I wish I could find out who drew this one and put it together. I can tell you where I stole it from, but that's not super helpful. I stole it from somebody on like Pinterest. But it's kind of nice to be able to print out and go, okay, cool. There's a... Questions on the Moulinet?
So I just practice cutting over and over and over again.
Right. And I feel like we can sit here and we can keep cutting if people want to do that. It's fine. So the other thing, Hutton does this some, Roworth does it some, is he talks about starting in a middle guard, and then you're going to make that cut with the lunge, so you're going to work on making that cut. Now, Hutton a lot of times talks about bringing it back to the middle as you come back. My 2 cents is think about where you have essentially, if you're thinking about defending against their cut, you're beating their attack. We're going to start here in that position. We're going to cut down, and then parry to the outside or parry to the outside, and then bring it back. The reason I like this better is it gives you a smart motion for your cut. So you're here, you're going to step forward, you're going to make your cut, you're going to parry, you're going to come back. Step forward, you're going to make your cut. You're going to parry, you're back, cut, parry, back, cut, parry, back. We can do that as much as you guys want. What I'm going to try to do with these classes is I hate the idea of spending like a whole bunch of time on drills that you can do by yourself, as long as you're actually going to do them. But we can practice that, right? So we go back to here, we're going to cut from below. So rather than being in our middle position, we're going to kind of drop to the outside. That 3 cut, I spent a lot of time looking at it. That 3 cut, he says, is true edge, which is annoying, to say the least. Because to do it, you're then flipping your wrists so that you can cut underneath. It's fine, I guess. I like it, false edge, but that's less important. So those first cuts, we're gonna go here, we're gonna cut, we're gonna parry. We're gonna cut, we're gonna parry. We're going to cut from underneath. At this point in time, we can bring it up into that high guard and then down. That not quite a hanging. I'd have to figure out where he talks about it specifically. Same thing on the other side. Now we're going to cut from. I guess you could cut from here. So you cut where it's in the middle, but you can also cut from underneath. And now we're going to cut with that lunge, bring it down. Now, when you have it up here, you can leave it up here and then drop into your middle guard, or you can bring it up here and hang it to the outside, but hanging it to the outside seems awkward. It seems really awkward because then you're coming on the other side of their sword. So that 4, we're going to cut from here, bring it up, and then we're just going to bring it down. So we can do a couple of those. Start here. Again, if your legs are killing you, I want people to like take a break. So we're going to start here. We're going to cut, parry, cut, parry, cut, parry, cut, parry. 5s and 6s, you can do the same thing. So you're up. We'll angle this a little bit. So I end with that 4. I end up here. If you remember the Meyer stuff with the Meyer stuff that Nate was going over, where you have steer, essentially you're hanging it, but you're essentially up here. From here, you can cut across. So you're essentially going to step out and you're going to cut across. Bring it back to the middle as you retreat. Cut across. The middle as you retreat. Questions on those?
I was going to just comment. I think this is probably one where having that first diagram would be useful, because I think you could easily change up what guards you use in between each cut. But I am finding it exceptionally helpful to actually think about, I'm cut, parry, cut, parry, cut, parry, instead of I'm cutting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm cut, parry, 2, cut 1, parry, 2, parry, 3, parry,
Yeah.
4, parry. That that helps keep the footwork in line as well. Like I can do them straight cutting stationary, but if you start trying to step with every cut without parrying, it gets eh.
Well, and here is my problem, and this is more a pedological problem that I have with Hutton. Is Hutton says you go into that lunge position, you make that lunge and you make that cut, and then you just go back into the middle as you retreat.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying do
Wait,
cut 1, 2.
yeah, and he's going to that middle, that upper middle, where you're just bringing up in the middle. My problem with that, and again, this is probably pedological as much as anything, but my problem with that is if I make this cut, and then I think of retreating by bringing it back in line, I'm not taking into account where my opponent's sword has gone. So if I am using this to parry, I've parried it, now I want to make sure that stays offline as I come back. And then I'm going to go back. What he's telling us to do is you make the cut, and then you just come back to the middle. And I'm like, well, that's great if you hit your target. If you hit what you're aiming at with that first cut. But if you're using it, if your cut is a parrying action, then you want to make sure that you've cut it and then you're parrying before you come back to that middle.
Right.
I'm going to cut, and then I'm just going to come back to the middle. You can do it either way. I mean, both ways work. I think both ways can be good. But my personal opinion is cut and then think about parrying from that cut before you move on to the next thing. Especially if what I'm doing is I'm cutting and then I'm parrying as I bring my stance back. So I'm, Sam. So I cut and then I'm parrying as I cover that line and come back into my fighting stance. Slipping the leg, we did, we can do slipping the leg, but I think we did that with warm-ups. I think it's not a bad thing to work on. Is you start in your fighting stance, and then you just slip the leg. You just bring it back. If it's easy to slip the leg, then you know that your positioning is right because you can move your leg without having to shift off your lead leg. So another thing that I found interesting as we were going through it all, as I was going through it all to get ready for this week, and there's not a whole lot left that I have. We have a half hour, so we can talk about any of this that we want. Is the ways in which Hutton defines measure. And my opinion is that I'm actually gonna take Hutton's definitions and include them into our newly revised beginner's curriculum that has not been revised yet, but will be at some point in time. For measure, here is his definition, and I like this. Measure is the exact space taken in a straight line between combatants which must be traveled by a lunge, or traversed by a lunge. Easy definition, right? It's the exact space that you have to cover to hit your opponent. That's measure. And I have struggled with how you define measure for a long time, and that kind of does it better. A perfect measure is when, with the lunge and without having previously moved the left foot, you can strike some part of the opponent. So perfect measure is I can step out and I can just hit them. That's what we have been calling in measure for a while, but I feel like he defines it better. Out of measure is when it's necessary to advance at least one step in order to be near enough to touch the adversary. So, the heck? All right. So out of measure is when it's necessary to advance at least one step in order to touch the adversary. So what that means is you're moving your back foot. It means you're close enough that, or you're far enough out that you have to take a step in with your back foot, so then you can step. Within measure is when you are so near that you can touch or be touched without lunging. So when we have talked about pub rules for single stick, that is within measure. You don't have to lunge. We are close enough that I am standing here in position and I can hit you without taking a step, without lunging. More so, if you're within measure, you're actually going to end up, if you lunge, you're actually going to end up hitting them without, if you do lunge. So don't do that. And core to core is when you're close enough that it's possible to grapple. So I'm going to, these are things that I'm probably going to include into our beginners curriculum because they're concepts that I've had a hard time bringing words to, but they're actually really useful the way that he defines them. Do we have questions? I will send out some of this stuff as far as these are some of the drills that we went over so that people have notes. Because I feel like there's a lot of good stuff here. So far, what are people's impressions of this?
I like it. I think it has, I mean, not that anything exists in a bubble when it comes to any kind of art with the sword, or they all have very similar. They have crossover. Everything has crossover. Even even rapier to longsword has crossover. But I like that when it comes to single-handed stuff, this is, I mean, you can apply this from my limited experience to basically any other single-handed sword, which I think is kind of nice. It gives, I think, a good basis for all the other single-handed stuff.
So what we'll do next week too is we'll look at some of these other guards. In fact, we may end up repeating some of the same material, using some of the different guards, using some of the stuff if you've had it in front of you so that you can look at it. Good. Other observations, things you've noticed?
One thing I'd mention, well, it kind of goes back to what you're saying about, you strike and then parry with when you're doing the drills. David Rawlings has this idea of when you're doing a sword drill, make every move with that sword have intention. It's not just going from point to point, but you attack, you defend, you attack, you defend, and you don't just move it meaninglessly.
Mm-hmm. No, I actually I really agree with that, because especially for that same point, when we first started doing that, I'm like, okay, I wasn't thinking of that. I was thinking of just okay, moving from one cut to the next, which I found wasn't working with the footwork, but throwing the pairing in there as a deliberate midpoint between each of those, I found exceptionally useful in keeping that again, so that it makes it so every move has a point rather than there being extraneous movements moving from one cut to the next, where you're not really safe, where you're not really doing anything practical, and it helps keep tempo as well.
Well, and if we compare this to Meyer, Meyer puts you in, most of the time, he puts you in a position where you're ready for your next cut at the completion of the cut. The fact that the 1 comes from above on the right and the 2 comes above from the left, you have to do something. You can't complete this cut and be in position that you're already starting up here. You have to move into position that you can start that second cut. And I find that parrying helps, because then you're cutting and then you're thinking, okay, now I'm going to parry in such a way that now your parrying is your motion to the next position. Other things.
See, Josh posted something.
With longsword and spear, I don't think we've learned single arm combat techniques. I've been enjoying seeing these. I need to clear up more home space to practice them myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the, I'm not sure if you have audio, Josh, but like one of the things that I think is very helpful, like incorporating single-handed work into your other weapon work, like really, like one of the best ways to improve your whatever primary weapon system you're choosing to practice, one of the best ways to improve yourself in that weapon system is to branch out into other weapon systems and then come back to that weapon system. So like using the single-handed stuff, it gives you new perspectives. So then once you come back to longswords, you can incorporate some of that just general martial knowledge, which is something that I find is very helpful. I know a lot of us have tended to stick to longsword, but incorporating other things ultimately does benefit us.
One thing that I'm noticing, the more that I study this stuff and the more that I'm working on it so that we have good material to work from, is some of the crossover. There are some things that are universal, but I pick them up and then I say, okay, how does this apply to longsword? How can I apply this concept to spear? Now, some things aren't going to have crossover. Turning your body to the side isn't always going to be beneficial with the longsword, because if you have 2 hands on it, you kind of need that hip rotation. Most of the Saber stuff is light enough that you're using your shoulders and you're using your arms, but you're not necessarily engaging your hips. You're not necessarily, because a lot more of it's on the line. And so it's, but it always helps me as far as my learning curve goes to start with something, work it out a little bit, and then say, okay, how does this apply to whatever system I'm practicing it? Good.
Indeed.
Anybody else?
Does does anybody have anything that they like of what we've gone over that they want, they feel needs more explanation, or they want to refer back to of what has been gone over so far? Is everyone fairly comfortable with stuff? We ask crickets.
Yes, crickets. So what I'll do is I'll get an email out tonight. we still have 20 minutes of class. I'm okay with calling class at this point.
I mean, I think we've been over a fair bit of material, so
We have.
and
And
I think we're okay.
I'll send out some of these, especially that cut diagram. That seems to be incredibly helpful. And then we can go over some of these guards. We can play with some of this stuff, having looked at it individually next week. Cool. So I'll make sure that stuff gets out in email this week. And I know that I have everybody's emails because you all signed up for the class. So we're golden.
One thing we might consider doing is notice a lot of these guards look like identical to a bunch of the Bolognese guards, and all the Bolognese guards have names. So we might consider, see if we can find the appropriate names for the guards. That makes it easier for me, at least, to remember them and know where they are.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And he has names for some of these guards. I'll pull what I can as far as the stuff goes next week. And the funny thing is that it happens with Hutton. Hutton has, so he'll give us guards and he'll give us information. And at the very beginning of his cuts, like right here, the St. George's Guard after James Miller, 1737. So he's actually using pictures from text from other masters. When he does bayonet, great stick, that's all him. Constable's truncheon. You know, this is how you use a little stick. Dagger. So he's going through all this stuff with the dagger and seizing daggers and whatever. Seizure 1 after Morozzo. And he's literally using one of the later Italian texts. Like, this is how you do dagger. So, the kind of what I said in my initial email, Hutton is existing in a period where he's trying to recreate some of this stuff, but he's pulling it together from the sources that they have, and they're limited. I wish sometimes that the interest in this hadn't kind of died right around World War I, because it makes me wonder how much further along we would be in our interpretations of things now versus where we are, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else?
Go around and do stuff we learned today.
Yeah. Something you learned today.
Honestly, I'm just gonna point out that same thing where we were talking about like being deliberate with emotions and adding don't just because so sometimes you have to fill in a couple gaps. So with the cutting diagram, for example, he's cutting a cut, but he's not, at least what I saw of the cut diagram itself, he doesn't actually specify cut, then do something else, and then cut again. He's just showing the cutting diagram of I'm moving point A, B, C, D, basically those cuts 1 through 6. And this is just something that is common throughout a lot of interpretation in my experiences. There are times where you have to fill in the gaps. And in this case, that gap is, no, you are actually resetting in some way, whether that be a parry or resetting to that middle guard, but you do have to to do some kind of reset between actions, or and this is just applies more to, you have to fill in the gaps, because in a lot of texts they're not going to say do step A, then A1, then A2, then B. It's, I'm going to give you A, B, C, D, E, but there are sub steps in there that you have to be aware of and follow. Take it around.
Okay, yeah, I'll go. Just kind of to add on to what Jack said, today as we were doing the cutting diagram, I was trying to think about and try to visualize where my opponent's blade might be at the time in order to be able to figure out what that intermediate action is. And that's not something I've focused on as much anymore. So that was really helpful for me.
Well, all the Saber's new to me, so everything I know about Saber I learned today.
There you go.
To answer your question, Josh, yes, I am recording it. So hopefully we'll be able to play it back later. We'll have it somehow so that we can, you can go back and look at it if you're looking for a good reference of what we did today.
Indeed.
I learned today that I am way out of practice with some of this, and I need to stand in those guards for a lot more time just to build up my strength to be able to do this, because we're doing a few of those things and I'm like, oh man, my thighs are killing me. So it's just, it's good feedback.
Let's see here. With I'll go. I mean, this was mostly a review from your previous Saturday class, Jordan. But I don't think you brought up the whole repositioning, doing that when making those cuts. So I didn't really like that, even though that's when it started to downpour on me, and I was like trying to run inside, and then as soon as I got most everything inside, it stopped raining. So, but I did like that, and like the discussion around that, because I do feel, because it's like you don't make a cut and then you're gonna and then make just a cut right away without having some kind of repositioning, and usually it's in the form of some kind of parry. So I really like that,
especially since he stays very linear. So unlike longsword, where you're not flipping from foot to foot back and forth, like you're keeping that same foot forward, so that changes that dynamic of it.
Yeah.
Let's see, Josh, I'm not sure if Josh, you have audio or if you're just stuck with text.
I'll go.
Sure.
I learned usually with longsword we move a lot more laterally, and working on the line all the time with Saber was interesting and different.
Yep, that is a definite. You have to shift mindsets a little bit.
Josh, do you have anything? Or
I'm guessing he's got text only, because
yeah, that's what it seems like.
yeah, that sounds like he's got
This work so I don't injure myself. Yes. Yes.
that is a very useful one, because doing this type of thing, it will ultimately lead end poorly.
The thing that I want to kind of end on is I took an Olympic fencing class years ago, and that's when I was teaching Saber. I had
Need more space.
yes, that's a good thing to know. I had an instructor who at one point in time was teaching, and he said he had been doing so much Olympic fencing that one of his thighs was actually considerably larger than the other. So he had a hard time buying pants. My 2 cents is, especially if you're doing some of these, it doesn't hurt to switch hands and then, okay, cool, I've done 20 of these cuts on one side, I'm going to do 20 of these cuts on the other side. Yeah. To answer your question, Adam, as far as what names he gives them, he has a section where he shows the names. But the names that he gives them is parry of high prime, parry of terse, parry of sixth, parry of high octave. So I will come up with a cheat sheet that I can attach with this picture so that we can go, okay, from left to right, this is what he's calling them, so that we actually have that reference. But that's good feedback for us, so that we can reference, okay, this is what we're specifically talking about. Okay, anything else? We have Thursday class. I have the link posted, and those are the correct links now. Fix them on this past Thursday. I kind of wish we didn't have to have class this way, but what it is. Everybody stay safe out there, and we will see you all next week.
Sounds good.
Thanks,
I'm just glad
Jordan.
we still have class.
What was that?
What was that, Kim?
Oh, I was just saying, thanks, Jordan. That was a lot of fun.
Good.
I was gonna say, just kind of general note for everyone. I mean, Kirsten is still doing classes on Mondays. I'm still doing classes on Thursdays. Truett is still doing classes on Saturdays, and we're obviously doing classes on Saturdays during this time slot. So, obviously, there are still classes to jump in on, depending on your schedule and what you want to do. But things will vary. I mean, between like warm-ups, kind of more lecture style, kind of. We all have slightly different teaching styles, but we are still trying to have classes. So, basically, still try to get your HEMA fix in.
And didn't Kristen add like a Tuesday or Wednesday class or something
It's
too?
a Wednesday class. We've been going over Meyer stuff. We just started doing like body mechanics for Meyer last week. And we're going to do like some mixed weapons. I think next week we're doing dagger. So you're all welcome to that too.
So now
Yeah.
there's a Monday, a Wednesday, a Thursday, and 2 Saturday classes.
Yep. So the options are there. I forget about the Wednesday because the Wednesday's like the one day where I've been working like late like every week. So it's I usually don't leave the office till like 7. So it's hard to make those.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we will see you guys next time. Be safe, and hopefully we can get back together in December if numbers are on their way down. Today's numbers were not looking good, and I'm not expecting them to drop quickly. So what we get.
Yep. Every bit of sparring equipment up for Christmas. Yes. Sparring equipment for Christmas is probably a good thing.
I just want to be able to spar for Christmas.
That would be nice too.
All right, guys. Have a good day.
All right. Enjoy
Yep.
the weekend.
See y'all.